You're listening to Retail Disrupted, a podcast that explores the latest industry developments and the trends that will shape how we shop in the future. I'm your host, Natalie Berg. It is a pleasure to have Maureen Hinton on the show this week. Maureen recently retired from her role as Group Research Director at Global Data Retail, where she previously led a global team of analysts and was responsible for retail and apparel content. Maureen, however, has not retired from retail, and today she spends her time writing and commenting on retail matters in the media, as well as at industry events. She's also working on ad hoc consultancy projects and is a longstanding member of the KPMG Retail Next retail think tank. So I've had the privilege of getting to know Maureen better over the past year, and I am honored to have her on the show today. Maureen, welcome to Retail Disrupted.
Oh, hi, Natalie. It's nice to speak to you. Well, you and I both sit on the KPMG Retail Next think tank, so we meet quite often. And yes, I've sort of semi-retired. I was running the research team, the retail research team at Global Data. And now I'm more freelance. I've done some chairing of a conference for them and just doing some opinion pieces and just keeping up with what's going on in retail with commentating, etc. So it's great to be doing this with you. It's nice to be able to chat to you and also everybody else on the team at the KPMG think tank as well, getting the view of what's going on everywhere.
Well, it certainly sounds like you're keeping busy. So again, really appreciate you taking the time to be here today. So we are going to be talking about retailer resilience. But first, I want to get your thoughts on consumer resilience. We've had some positive news recently with inflation easing. And in recent months, we've even seen wage growth outpacing inflation. So encouraging headlines, but of course, if you dig a little deeper, you get a slightly more nuanced picture. Yes, inflation is decelerating, but it's still more than twice the 2% target set by the Bank of England. Yes, wages going up and inflation going down is good news, but consumers have had 2 years now of high inflation eroding their purchasing power. So I don't think they're going to feel the effect of this overnight, and they're certainly not going to alter their spending habits overnight. And the last thing I'd say is that consumer prices, food prices especially, are still pretty high. So the latest ONS data from October showed that UK food inflation dropped to 10.1%. So it is easing, but it's still pretty high. Prices are still 30% higher than they were in January 2021. And if you look at some specific products, prices of sugar, baked beans, canned tomatoes, cooking sauces, all of these products are still at least 50% higher than in January 2021 as the benchmark. So my take, Maureen, is that all is not rosy. We're not economists. I'm not going to ask you for, your economic outlook here, but I'm curious to get your general take on the consumer right now. Are retailers going to have to continue to fight tooth and nail to capture some of that spend? Or do you think maybe we're starting to move in the right direction and retailers can finally breathe a sigh of relief?
Well, I don't think retailers can ever breathe a sigh of relief in the current situation. I think the consumer has been fairly resilient, and post-COVID, there was quite a lot of COVID savings that we were spending. So we had that to fall back on. I'm not saying everybody had COVID savings. Obviously, there were a lot of people that didn't. But we also saw that bounce back to physical retail. And I think that was because we're social animals. We want to get out. We stopped buying everything online because we want to go and look at stores. And so we've seen that big bounce back. But I think what's going to happen in the future, we're going to get back to that equilibrium where you'll see that online sales are slightly ahead of physical sales. And it'll go back to a much lower level than it has been before. And I think the main problem is that now what we're seeing, as you were saying about inflation, is prices are so high that we're being much more selective about what we buy. And therefore, one of the things the ONS reported that everybody jumped on last week was that volumes were down. They were negative and they were down more than commentators were expecting. But what they don't ever sort of focus on is that sales are up. So sales have been increasing, though not in line with inflation, nowhere near in line with inflation. But that just means that we're buying fewer items all the time, and volumes have been negative since a year ago last March. So it just means that there are some winners and some losers. And I think within retail, what we're doing is we're being very selective about what we buy. We all have to eat, so you can see that the supermarkets do okay, although not all of them. But it's on sort of non-food that we're becoming much more selective.
Yeah, I think you're right. And there's always winners and losers within retail. The point about the pandemic savings rather is it's really interesting because the Bank of England has said now that UK households have probably run down their COVID savings. And it's always I can imagine a really hard thing to to measure. But I think, to a certain extent, especially when it came to discretionary spending, which I think we're all being a little bit more cautious doing, regardless. But I think that that has certainly helped to provide a buffer, certainly helped to kind of prop up a little bit of the spending, perhaps, that we've seen over the past couple of years. And then also, again, without getting, too focused on the economy here, but also the fact that interest rate rises, um, I think that's putting the fear in a consumer group that has up until pretty recently been largely insulated from the cost of living crisis. So it'll be interesting to see the effect of mortgage bills going up at the same time as, although inflation is easing, it is decelerating. We still have prices going up in shops. So I think that combination will be interesting to see how that plays out, into the next year.
Yeah, I think it hits discretionary spending a lot. And during COVID, so many households spent a lot of money on their houses and spent money on, electricals. And of course, when you buy big ticket items, you don't buy those every year. So there's going to be a time lapse before people will be investing in big ticket items, and they haven't got the money to invest. So it's in those kind of areas that it's going to be much slower. And as you say, with mortgage rates going up and interest rates as well, which means that if you're borrowing money, it's more expensive. So I think, we are going to see much lower growth going forward, and it's going to be much harder for those sort of also ran retailers to generate income, especially if they haven't got the financial backing, which is, what having a financial strength is really necessary, as well as having brand strength.
Yeah, so that's a nice segue to move on to retail resilience. So we're going to talk about how retailers can build resilience, or in some cases rebuild it, and then crucially how they can maintain it. So, Maureen, which retailers spring to mind when you hear the word resilience, and what is it that they're getting right?
Well, I think it's always Next that springs to mind, because they're Simon Wolfson, or Lord Wolfson, is so transparent about what they're doing, what their strategy is. But you can see it's also very analytical. Everything is analysed, including the consumer, and that is really what's sort of driving the growth, is understanding what the consumer is doing, but also keeping costs down, running efficient businesses. And also, I think there is also, you can say, because we've lost some of those weaker players like Debenhams, you're picking up sales from those that exit the market. So there's some sort of help that being given by a smaller market. So the spending is going over, say, fewer retailers.
I'd agree with that. I think Next is a great example of a retailer that just consistently gets it right. And, a lot of people refer to Next as a bellwether, but I think they're more sort of the gold standard of high street retailing. And yeah, I absolutely agree. I think, data is the heart of their business. I said this on a previous podcast episode with Graham Salt. One of the stats that I love about Next is that they went into the pandemic with over half of their sales already online. So again, it just shows, they were a real early adopter in terms of digitizing their physical space, but also evolving their e-commerce model. They're moving much more towards a marketplace model, and they're not the only fashion retailer, of course, to do this. But also in terms of maintaining price integrity, that's another thing I think Next does really well. They don't just offer those blanket discounts every 6 weeks or so. They really do hold on to that their pricing, and I think that plays a role as well. So
I, th- I
yeah.
think I think also that they've learnt from mistakes because they haven't always been great at everything they do. They got fashion wrong a few times in the past, and I remember one of their presentations, them saying, well, the CEO saying that they were playing it too safe. So there's more ability to take a risk. They've got a culture where it's about about innovation
Mm.
and taking managed risks because everything is analysed very well. But I think that that's what you have to do. You have to keep moving forward all the time and learn from mistakes, and that's what Next has been doing. And I think the other sort of standout performance at the moment, obviously, is M&S, which has turned around what is, has been a sort of very lackluster retailer for a long time. But that is, again, just looking at everything very closely and focusing on the consumer and innovating.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned M&S because I think that's a really nice segue, especially around the topic of admitting that you get things wrong, you learn from your mistakes, and you pick up and start again. One of the things I thought was really interesting from their most recent trading update was their CEO Stuart Macon posted a video on LinkedIn, and he talked about M&S being, in his words, positively dissatisfied.
Yeah, I
And
thought that was great. That's a very good um, use, I think, of a strategy. Being positively dissatisfied with everything you do means that you're always going to be trying to improve, isn't it?
Exactly, exactly. You used the word restless as well, and I thought that's the kind of mentality that retailers need um to not only survive but to really thrive during this period of change and disruption. And also, it sounded a little bit like Amazon. I mean, obviously I've spent a lot of time, researching and
Yeah.
talking about Amazon, and the way that I sum up Amazon's success in one line is that they have a relentless dissatisfaction with the status quo. I think that is the best way to sum up what's kind of led them to be so successful. And I think it's really inspiring to see some legacy high street retailers taking on that mentality and recognizing that complacency isn't an option, that you can't rest on your laurels. I think everybody knows that, but actually going and turning around a super tanker like M&S, I mean, that takes a lot of time, a lot of investment, and as you pointed out already, a lot of cultural change as well.
Yeah, I think complacency is a very good word because there's no way retailers can be complacent about anything these
Mhm.
days because it's shifting and you've got so much competition out there. You've always got to be better at what you do.
Yeah, absolutely. And M&S, I mean, M&S really has struggled, I'd say for decades with
Yeah, yeah,
an identity
definitely.
crisis, right? It's been a long time coming. And I think, for a long time they were trying to be all things to all people. And I always say that if you were building a retailer from scratch today, there is no way that you would put together premium food, mid-market clothing, and then chuck some furniture and put all of that under one roof. I mean,
No,
you just
no,
that's
I
not what you
agree.
would build, right? So
But I
they
think,
oh, carry
sorry,
on. No, carry on.
I was going to say, I think the fact that they've got a completely new fashion team in, I think Maddie Evans has done, and her team, because it's not just her, but they brought in from outside, they brought in that, you know, well, obviously Arcadia went bust, but they had a very strong fashion presence and they were much speedier, especially with Topshop. So I think just bringing in new energy and also understanding what the consumer wanted, that you want style as well as quality and value. And that's what they lacked all the time in fashion is style. I went years without buying anything at M&S because it was so boring. But they've really managed to turn that round. But again, that's something that, as I said, with Next, you can never sit on your laurels with one season. You have to keep improving all the time and keep really engaging with the customer.
Yeah, I think M&S has done really well to reposition itself, and I think they have had to take some risks in order to stay relevant. So, they will, I think naturally they will have alienated some customers as part of this is part of their new strategy and new focus. But I think that, focusing more on, for example, young families, I know that's been a really big strategic move for them, and it's paying off. So I
Well,
think, okay, carry on, go ahead.
no, I was going to say because you can't just follow your customer because your customer literally dies. So you've all, I think one of the things Next has always aimed at that family life stage. That's had to, that 25 to 45-year-old family life stage. I think that M&S is slightly older and perhaps slightly richer than the typical Next customer. And Next has got a very big children's wear offer, which just actually shows where it is in a way. But yes, you're right. It's just identifying and engaging with that particular life stage is where you're going to have most of your spending, really, especially for that kind of mid-market retailer.
Yeah, and I
Yeah,
think
and I think
being braver and going after a specific demographic, then you get a clearer focus around how you build a product or build, a range for those for that core customer. And yes, I think their stores needed refreshing and revitalizing. They needed to catch them in digital, and I think they've done really, really well to do all of those things. But I think at the end of the day, the biggest factor in my view, and be curious to hear what you think, Maureen, but I think the biggest factor in their turnaround has really been focusing on product.
Oh, definitely. That was one of the things that really annoyed me with one of their presentations a few years back was that it was talking about their strategy, but product was not the first thing that they were looking at. It was sort of way down the line. And obviously, product, if you haven't got a good product or an attractive product at the right price first time, then why will people shop with you? It's like
Exactly. Yeah.
Gap used to be was it was never the right price. It was always discounted. It's you're on a losing path if you don't get the product right.
Yeah. And something I've noticed this week, because obviously I've been following Black Friday very closely. We're recording this on Wednesday, November 22nd. Black Friday is officially this Friday, November 24th, although it feels like it's been going on it has been going on for weeks. It doesn't feel like it. It has been going on since the beginning of November. But I've been watching all the retailers really closely, and I've noticed that M&S has not pulled the trigger yet. They're one of the few retailers that have not offered Black Friday deals. Maybe they're holding out for the big day, but a few years ago, I think by now you'd see those big blanket discounts, 20% off everything, and I think that in itself is a sign that they are being more strategic and more targeted in some of these big events.
Yeah, I think that's happening with quite a few retailers now. Though even those that have got Black Friday offers, they're not. It's not blanket Black Friday offers. It's just a select few, and I think that's it just shows in a way how retailers don't want to lose margin just by throwing offers at us just before Christmas. Because, as I said before, we are being quite selective about what we buy. We don't want to just spend lots of money just because it's got a low price. We're just thinking, do we really need this? Do we really want this? So, why lose margin when it's not necessary?
Yeah, I think consumers are definitely being more mindful this year. They're being those discretionary purchases, which let's face it, fashion is very discretionary. They are more considered. But also, I guess be interesting to get your views, Maureen, on how the weather has impacted retail. We've had unseasonably warm weather this autumn. We had a very wet July, and I know that's kind of wreaked havoc with fashion retailers over the past few months. But I mean, to what extent do you think are retailers kind of sitting on excess inventory because the weather has stopped us from wanting to buy, coats and scarves and gloves and that kind of thing? And do you think there'll be deep discounts as a result?
I think there's probably going to be discounts on things like coats and scarves. But I always find this nobody in retail is prepared to be brave and not bring in their winter heavyweights until October. They always bring them in September, and we always seem to have a warm September. It's just it's a practice that's gone on for years, and nobody wants to break it. So unless you actually bring in that product knowing that you probably will have to discount it at some stage and build that into the margin, you're always going to lose out. And
Yeah,
you're right, the weather in the UK, the weather does have an impact on us because it tends to be a bit up and down. If it's warm at the right time, then you get good sales of summer product. If it's warm in the winter, then we're left with lots of heavyweight product.
Yeah, I have seen just in the past couple of days a lot of oh my God, I think all of our inboxes are probably filled with Black Friday deals. It's always a really good time to unsubscribe from those retailers that you maybe don't shop from on a regular
Yeah.
basis. But yeah, I have seen more and more, and I won't name and shame, but initially I saw the odd 25% off deals, but just in the past couple of days I've seen more and more of those across a number of high street brands, and I was surprised because I think what I've observed this Black Friday, and I dedicated a whole podcast episode to this last week, but what I've observed is retailers looking to things like flash sales, VIP access, pre Black Friday discount codes, again trying to make instill that sense of urgency, but also this idea that this code is special. It's just for you. You're one of our preferred customers, so that might encourage shoppers to loosen their purse strings. But it's been interesting for me just to observe. And again, this is purely anecdotal, but I've definitely seen more and more fashion retailers offering those kind of 20-25% off everything
I
deals.
think one of the things, though, that and I would be interesting to see what Zara's reports when it reports its sales, because I felt that fashion itself wasn't helping retailers this season because it's so embedded into browns and camels and greys and blacks. I've never seen Zara look so boring. You go in there and there's no colour. And I just wonder if that will have an impact on its sales, or whether its younger customer doesn't have loads of black and grey already. But
Yeah.
it would be interesting to see that, because I have noticed that some of the ranges that I've seen that I would normally buy from, I thought, oh God, that's really boring, and haven't bought from them. Now I'm getting, they keep on emailing me saying they've got 20% off, and it's blanket coverage. They've got 20% off, I was just saying. So I think it's not just weather, it could also be that rather boring fashion. And I think M&S does have some of that, but it has far more colour. The fact that it's got, it was showing that it's saturated blue, and it's lime green has done really well for it. And I think, we do need a bit of cheering up sometimes.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I just had a look at Zara's website as you were talking, and they are not currently doing Black Friday as well. So
Yeah.
it's funny as we get closer to the actual day, this list of retailers not offering discounts is getting smaller and smaller. But interesting to see some big high street brands like Zara and M&S still holding out, I presume, for the actual day.
I think, do they just discount what's not selling well rather than go into Black Friday, because that in a way denigrates the brand rather, doesn't it? It loses a bit of its exclusivity if it's just a Black Friday deal from a fashion retailer.
Yeah, I think by the fourth week of November, we are all suffering from Black Friday fatigue, right? I'm curious, Maureen, to get your views on how successful you think Black Friday will be this year, because I'm getting the sense that views are pretty polarized on this. And it's always fun to have this debate as industry observers. But on the one hand, the naysayers are taking the view that, look, the consumer is feeling fragile. We've already talked about things like mortgage rates going up, no pandemic savings to fall back on. And then on top of all that, the official Black Friday day, the 24th of November, falls before payday. So that will impact some shoppers' ability to spend. Then you have this other camp who are saying, actually, we're going to have a bumper Black Friday. Yes, we agree with all of the doom and gloom, but Christmas won't be canceled. People still want deals. They're going to work harder and be smarter to make their budgets go further. And therefore, Black Friday becomes even more relevant. So what do you think, Maureen? What kind of Black Friday are you expecting?
I don't think it's going to be a bumper Black Friday in that you're going to see massive more sales than there were last year. I think, as we were saying, I think people are being very selective. And it is a case of bringing forward your Christmas spend when to get a bargain, which has always been the case, I think, with Black Friday. You're looking, if you've got money to spare, then you'll spend it because you're getting a good deal. But it's really like a sale period before Christmas. So if you can, if you're looking for an air fryer, for instance, why not buy it now if you can get it at a lower price than you would normally have had to spend on it? So it's things like, it's about being selective. I just don't think, the general trend is that we're not buying lots and lots of things anymore. We're being more selective about what we spend our money on. So I think there will be sales, but it's going to be, I think, things like clothing and fashion are less likely to benefit from it because we don't need those things and we're not really being driven by must-haves. Whereas, as PwC has said recently, when they've done a survey, haven't they? And they found that men tend to be the ones that have said they're going to spend more this time and they're more likely to spend because they're looking at technology. And that makes sense. So if you can get technology at a lower price. But I think it was quite interesting that there are no really strong technology trends coming through because there's no new sort of launches of anything that would make you want to buy specific technology at the moment. So I tend to think I don't think it's going to be a big bumper Black Friday, but you could prove me wrong, Natalie.
We can have a debrief post Black Friday. I might be wrong as well. I think that's part of the fun of being an analyst and getting to put your predictions out there and see when you're right and when you're not. But have you bought anything, Maureen?
No, I haven't. I did earlier in the summer when Amazon had its Prime Day. I did buy an air fryer, but then I sent it back because it was far too big for our kitchen. So took over the kitchen.
Oh, so buyer's remorse.
Buyer's remorse. Or should have measured it better, I think is what I should have done.
Well, this is it. It's so easy to get swept up in the frenzy. And I have to admit, I have been spending when I've been buying big ticket things that I had been holding out for. So a dining table, chairs.
That's exactly it. I think that is the thing, is that people will be selective about what they buy because they really want it rather than just that, just thinking, oh, that looks great, I'll buy it. They're probably not browsing as much. They're making more targeted shopping trips now.
Yeah, and perhaps more of a focus on Christmas gifts rather than, self-care and buying for yourself, as we've seen in the past, because Black Friday is always a nice time to indulge, but maybe we'll see a little bit less of that this year.
I think it'll be less impulse buying. That's what's happening, really.
Yeah, for sure. Well, that brings us to a close for today. Thank you so much for joining me, Maureen. And to our listeners, make sure you check out the show notes where you can learn more about Maureen and also connect with her on social media. Thank you for listening to Retail Disrupted. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to support the podcast, please leave a rating or review or share it with others. It really makes a difference.